guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, part 3 of our roll top desk build. Well, that back panel is glued up and we've checked it for square, and let me just pan off here. There you go, you can see it all clamped up. That was how we ended last week's show. And this week we're going to start off with the face frames for the desk. That will be the openings for the drawers and the writing trays, etc., etc. So why don't we head to the bench and see what we're looking at for measurements and a cut list. Well, as I said, we're going to be working on the face frames, which would be this section right here of your desk build. And of course there'll be this middle one here for your center drawers and this one here for your side drawers. Now, I've gone through and checked the measurements, and so far I'm not seeing a lot of discrepancies. In fact, I haven't found any yet, but we'll know a little better once we get further into it. But for this particular section of these plans, it all calls for 3/4 inch thick material. And for the most part, with the exception of the center rail and the base rails, which would be these bottom ones down here, they're calling for 1.25 inch wide material with varying lengths. There's 29 and 10 3/4. So I'm going to mill all of this 3/4 stock, rip them to their sizes of 1.25 inch, and I'm going to follow the same pattern as I have been before, where I'm going to label the pieces such as this A, B, C, D, etc., so that I know exactly what I'm looking at with my stock. There's no chance for error that I grab the wrong piece. So I'm going to mill all of this, and then we're going to get into the dowel joinery of it all once we do the dry fit. And that's where you're going to see me next, is the dry fit of these face frames. I've got all of the pieces cut for our face frames, and we're going to do a dry fit. Fortunately for me, I was able to use all offcuts for this. I didn't have to do any milling. This is all from offcuts from doing all of the side and the back panel. But let's head over to the print and discuss exactly what it is that we're going to do with this section of the build. Now, as I said before, we are doing these face frames here. And what I've done is, out of some of the scrap offcuts, you can see at this section here we have a space of 3 inches between these two side rails. 4 inches here, 4 inches here, 6 inches here. So to assist me in doing the dry fit, I've cut scrap pieces to this length, one on either side. That way I can place them in between my 1.25 inch wide slats, and it will help me to avoid racking. So I'm going to do a dry assembly. We're going to head over to the bench, do the dry assembly, and once I get it clamped together and the way that I like it, checking it for square, I'm going to place all of the marks for this dowel joinery that's here, and then we're going to drill for those dowels. So as I was saying, I've got enough for one set of drawers here. This would be the left-hand drawers if you're looking from the front. This is the base plate, so you'll just sit the base plate just like this, and according to the plans, there's a 6-inch gap between this base plate and the next rail. So you can see that I've labeled them with black marker, and that's just to keep everything straight the way that so I can just quick reference, just look at it and know that I've got the right spacer in there. Now I've got 2 4-inch drawers now according to the print, so just like this. Then another side rail, just like that. Then there'll be a 3-inch drawer, then another rail, and there is now a 3/4 inch gap here. And for that, I have 1.5 tons of 3/4 inch stock. So I'm just going to put a piece in between there and lay in my last rail and clamp it together. Well, now that you've got a dry fit together, you get an idea of what it is we're looking at. And this here will be a writing table in this 3/4 slot. This is a smaller 3-inch drawer, 4-inch, 4-inch, and then a 6-inch drawer at the bottom. We're going to leave the spacers in just for the time being while we mark for the dowels. But before you do any marking, you really want to check it at this point in time to make sure that every single thing here is perfectly square. I'm happy with the fit. I'm happy with the fact that everything is square. And I'm also happy with the way that all of these particular pieces fit together. So for that reason, I don't want them to get mixed up. So I'm going to number these from 1 to, well, whatever we end up with. There's 3, there's 4. I'm writing upside down here. Not bad for writing upside down. Wow, look at that. I just did one backwards. 5, and there's 6. And then I'll mark it as left and right. I don't want these to get mixed up when I'm drilling because I like the way they fit. Now, my particular doweling jig that I'm going to be using marks or drills dowels at 3/4 centers. So at every point here, at every butt joint all the way along, I'm going to be marking for 3/4 centers, then use a square and mark across each one of those lines, making sure that everything is lined up. And then we're going to drill each one of those holes, and we want it to be able to accept a 1-inch long, 1/4-inch diameter dowel. And there we can see that all of the dowel holes have been drilled in both the styles and the rails that will make up the face frames for our drawer fronts. So now I've taken some 1/4-inch dowel and cut them into 1-inch length, and I'm going to do a dry fit, but the process here will be to glue the 1/4-inch dowels into our rails, and then from there we will be placing them just like so into our side frames. We're going to glue it all together, clamp it up, and then that will be it for our face frames. And there is our first face frame. Piece of advice, don't have your dowels too tight. If they're too tight fitting into those holes, it really gives you a hard time fitting in. I actually broke a couple off, and then with wet glue everywhere, had to drill them out and repair them while I was gluing this together. So don't have super tight dowels. The other thing as well is it works a lot better to use a bar clamp and pull this together than what it does trying to bash it together. So just remember that. It's okay to hammer the dowels into your center rails, but when it comes to putting the whole thing together, it works a lot better with steady pressure coming from clamps and tightening the clamps equally on both sides to squeeze it all in and hold it in place. So you've got one done. Repeat the process with the other one. That includes the dry fit and the spacing and all that jazz. Just remember that with the drawer on the right, it is not the same spacing as this. There is this particular drawer here, and there will be this one, but the bottom drawer is actually a file drawer, so it's much deeper. So just something to keep in mind when you're cutting your spacers for these face frames. We've got both those side face frames glued up. They're clamped. You want to let them dry overnight. You don't want them to start shifting and racking. And hopefully, as I said earlier, while you guys were gluing and clamping this together, you were checking everything for square. It's real important that you get this thing square because any little inconsistencies are going to transfer to the rest of the desk. So we've got those done. Now there's one more face frame to do, and that would be the one for the large center drawer. Now this is done with 1 inch wide stock, 3/4 of an inch thick. I don't think that we need the video of it. You saw the process with gluing together those side panels. So glue the entire center face frame together, and then I think what we're going to do is once all of this is dried up, we're going to give the whole desk kind of a little dry fit just to see where we're at. And there is the dry fit of our desk carcass. It's really hard to do a proper dry fit at this point because there's really nothing to register where the pieces go. And the type of joinery that'll be putting the face frames onto these side panels and the side panels onto the back panel is there's a 1/4 inch thick spline that's going to get put in all of that. And I think that's going to be our next step, is setting up our router and routing for that 1/4 inch spline. Well, when routing these splines, it's important that the grooves that you route for the spline itself, it's very important that they line up so that the edges of your board are flush. And I guess you can do a lot of setup and check everything out and make sure that it's dead center of the board, but you're still leaving yourself a margin of error, because if the groove in, say, the side panel and the groove of your face frame differ by, let's say, 3/16 or sorry, like 3/64 or 1/64 of an inch, you're going to have that overlap. So for this particular setup, what I'm going to do is I've got this piece of oak. I've made sure that the edge is perfectly flat, and I'm going to basically attach it to the base plate of my router as a fence. So by setting a piece of oak here, I've drawn a center line to show me where the center is roughly. We're going to line this up. I'm going to place my fence here using double-sided tape onto my base plate, and then I'm going to put a couple screws up through in the holes, these particular holes here underneath, obviously, into the base, into this makeshift fence, to be sure that this doesn't move. Now, you may be saying that if you've got the fence, how can there be deviations of this 1/64 or whatever? What I mean is, when you're routing, make sure that you keep the fence on the same side of all of the pieces. So when routing the face frames for your 1/4 inch spline, obviously you will be on the outside of the face frame. Just make sure that when you're routing for the panel that will mate with that, that you are running your fence on the outside of the panel. Running it on the inside is where you could cause that difference in measurement. So now that I've sort of cleared that up, maybe even confused you, let's attach this fence and route for our splines. Now you don't want to crank these screws down too much because you don't want to crack your base plate, but just a nice little snug fit will do perfectly. And of course the clamps were only on there to help the double-sided tape to adhere to the base plate. So now set your bit. These splines are going to be ½ an inch wide. So set your bit depth to ¼ of an inch and let's route those splines. Okay, so when routing the grooves for these splines, just some advice. For starters, run a test strip. And depending on which way you run the router in the stock, right to left, left to right, for those of you guys that aren't used to it, if you run it the wrong way, you end up with this. And that's not what you want. What you want is this. So my suggestion to you is to run a test piece so that you know which way you should be running your router for the best results and the most control of that router. And once you know which way to run the router, do this. Take a Sharpie, a marker, chalk, whatever you have, preferably something permanent, forget that chalk comment, and mark on your fence which way to run your router. Then you don't accidentally, while you're doing this kind of production style work, then you don't accidentally run your router the wrong way and end up with a really poor groove for your splines. Just a bit of advice for you. And now that we have the splines done in the 4 side panels, the 2 front face frames, and the edges of the back panel, we need to run some 1/4 inch stock for these splines. It doesn't have to be a solid piece. You can, use up your scraps. Great opportunity here. Rip some 1/4 inch strips for these splines. Once you get enough 1/4 inch material for all of the splines, you want to do another dry fit using the splines and pull it all together, because there's still 2 more spline grooves that we need to route into the back panel. Well, we're doing another dry fit, as I said, and you can see the splines here that are sticking up outside of the grooves that we just routed, and I've pulled all this together. And an important key part here is to make sure that everything at this point is perfectly square. Keep checking that as you go, because getting something out of square is a disaster from this point. So I've checked this to make sure that this one section is square. Just work one section at a time here, guys. You don't want to go crazy. And what we need to do is I need to mark this back edge here, because we need to route a mating groove for this spline back here onto the back panel. So on both sides of this board, once I've clamped it together, checked and double checked, triple checked, make sure everything is square, I'm going to mark those edges of the board, so I know exactly where the position is that that board needs to be. Now you may or may not be able to see it on camera here, but what I've got is a piece of oak, a scrap piece that mimics the exact distance of this front section here from the inside to inside of our side panels. And I've put that here and at the bottom to assist me in keeping this perfectly aligned until we can get a spline into here. So let's mark that, and then we can carry on with the other side, marking that as well. And then we're going to route that groove using a straight edge tool guide. While you're doing the dry fit, you want to check at this point for your center drawer. 23.5 inches from inside edge to inside edge. Check it at the back to make sure that it's the same. And you can dowel and assemble this front piece, as well as cut or drill the dowel holes in the side of the drawer face frames so that this whole section can be put together. Well, you can see we've got that straight edge here on the board. You don't need to use a commercially available one like this. Just a straight board clamp down will do. Remember that you need to figure out the offset between the edge of your base plate and your router bit in order to route perfectly where you need it. Other than that, route these grooves, and then we can do another dry fit once we get that center face frame made for our center drawer. Well, after checking my dry fit assembly and making sure that everything was square, I discovered that my long pieces for my center drawer on the face frame of it actually were 1/16 of an inch too short. So that's why we do the dry fits, and that's why we double check our measurements. No problem, I've cut 2 new pieces, and for this face frame, same process as what we did with the face frames for the drawers. I'm going to clamp this together, verify that it's square, mark it, and use our doweling jig to set it up to get it all put together. And once that's completed, I'm going to sit it in place in our desk assembly, pull it all together and check it again for square. Then I'm going to mark for the doweling jigs, and I'm going to drill the dowels drill the holes for the dowels for this to be mounted in the face frames of the drawers. So with that first set of dowels now drilled and ready to go, we can put this frame together for a test fit and check it for square. Again, I can't emphasize enough about checking things for square in this project, and just like that. So there is our face frame now for our middle drawer. We'll now take it over to the assembly. We're not going to glue it together just yet. First, we're going to put the marks, as I said. Same process. We're going to go 2 dowels in the top, 2 in the bottom on both sides, and do the same on the face frames. I don't think we need a video of it, but when you come back, I'll show you the final product of how that fits together with the face frame assembly. Well, we have our 4 holes drilled here, and our frame is glued together. It hasn't been sanded yet, but that's okay. And we're just going to do a test fit here. And it just goes in like that. So we're going to pop it into the other side now, and like there's no glue holding this, and it's holding up on its own. It's really well placed in here with those dowels. So I'm going to line it up at the other side, clamp it together, and check everything again for square. And I think once that's done, I'm going to glue this carcass together, and I really don't think we need a video of how to glue it together. I mean, bottom line is clamps, clamps, and, well, more clamps. So please keep in mind when you're gluing your carcass together, check for square as you go. It's imperative that this thing is square. So double check it again and then glue your carcass together. And with that, that's all the time we have for this week. A lot of progress made here and things are looking great. Really looking forward to next week, and I hope that you're going to join me for that when I bring you yet another woodworking video.